Why did Ford and GM just stop selling minivans in the late 2000s, giving up on the market to basically Honda, Toyota, and the Chrysler products? It's something that's always bothered me because they just gave up and stopped trying. But it turns out it was pretty prescient for them. Welcome back to All Cars, y'all. I am John, and I have done a whole video before about the history of the Chrysler minivans and their really complete dominance in the minivan market until probably the late 2000s, early 2010s. And it's a long and winding story. We're going to talk about it a little bit, the 25-year history that got us to the late 2000s when Ford and General Motors just stopped selling minivans and weren't going to develop anymore. It seems like an easy answer why they did, but some of the details behind it really show part of the rot in the American manufacturers. When the Chrysler minivans were introduced, they caught everybody flat-footed, and basically every other manufacturer had to really struggle and scramble around to try to find something to compete. Now, Ford and General Motors reached into their parts bin and created a couple of smaller vans based on truck chassis, one the Chevy Astro and the Ford Aerostar, and they were modestly successful and certainly have their fans out there for their ruggedness and their ability to tow. The Japanese manufacturers, for the most part, took delivery vans from Japan, gussied them up, and sent them over here. You got some from Mitsubishi, from Nissan, and to a lesser extent Toyota. The Nissan one was a particular mistake with the risk of fire. Toyota continued to develop it and came up with their Previa, a mid-engined minivan, which again has its fans but looks vaguely like a really sad egg. Now, Ford and GM didn't sit still. They began developing their own minivans, but each of them tried to do something a little bit different, specifically GM. They decided not only to compete with what Dodge and Plymouth were selling, but also to rethink it and try to re-revolutionize the minivan. And they came up with their Dust Buster minivans, which were widely panned and are not fondly remembered. Toyota and they continued developing their Previa into what became the Sienna. Now, Honda's first attempt was an Odyssey based on a Honda Accord, which was more Japanese sized. At least it kept the same general idea of front engine, front wheel drive, and a passenger compartment, but it was just a little too small. But it too, I've driven one of those. Those are really cool. They also have their fans. But Chrysler products remained absolutely dominant during this period. And one of the things I always give credit to Chrysler for, while they have some problems with engines and transmissions and of course general build quality of things becoming rattly or falling off over time, they really knew they had their cash cow and they put the emphasis in it, they put the resources in it and the thinking to continue to remain competitive and grow their vans, not just in size, but in terms of functionality for families. They are the ones who added that second sliding door. They're the ones that stylistically put the rail for the door beneath the window to hide it. They are the ones that came up with stow and go seating. They did all of these other things to continue to make their vans as competitive as possible. And they kept their leadership role until, I believe, the 2010s. Now, Ford eventually came up with the Windstar, which is a traditional looking minivan and was okay, and the Freestar after there. The Chevy eventually became the Uplander. The Odyssey grew into something that was more American sized, if you will, and became very, very competitive and a strong seller. Same thing with the Sienna, it became a very strong seller, and those two developed their reliability reputation along the way and started to become both of them second or third relative to just the Caravan. So when you get to that mid-2000s, what you have is a Ford product that was okay received, but didn't sell very well. Chevy had if we just look at the Uplander, a product that was not very well received and didn't sell very well. And the Toyota and the Hondas both outsold them pretty handily every single year, with that Dodge continuing to be dominant. Now, the prescient part of this conversation is that in 2007, when Ford canceled their minivans and afterwards GM in 2008 canceled theirs. If you remember, in 2008, that's when the downturn started and sales absolutely tanked. You can see on this chart the drop in sales that occurred, and so they had resources they needed to be putting somewhere else other than into their minivans. At the same time, minivan sales had been slowly decreasing over time. So the Ford and GM products, all of the different brands that GM was marketing these through, were trying to capture a slightly decreasing piece of pie. The second part of what was prescient is the rise of the SUV or the CUV. GM and Ford, for their many stupid decisions over the decades, they do have a lot of intelligence and they do have a lot of research, and they can see where trends are actually moving to. In both cases, they could take their minivan resources in design and in manufacturing and reallocate them to SUVs, and that's where the market moved to. And when you look at this chart, you can see that within a few years, SUVs and CUVs began to overtake traditional sedans in overall sales. So from that perspective, it makes a lot of sense why they decided to stop fighting for essentially last place and put their resources into something where they would be far more competitive, played into their strengths, decades and decades of strength, and have much higher profit margins. But it still has always bothered me that through all of the struggle of the 70s and the 80s and the 90s for the American manufacturers, things like that Ford Taurus came along. You saw the manufacturers stepping up and actually trying to fight toe-to-toe with the Japanese. Quality improved overall, life expectancy, styling in many cases improved. They never gave up. They tried to get better and they tried to keep swinging. But both for Ford and especially for GM, it feels like they never really put their heart into it. Whether it was quality of materials, whether it was design, ride, handling, or manufacturing, it always felt like the minivan project was something they felt they needed to be in, not something they went out to actually try to dominate. They just felt they needed to have an entry into it. Through multiple generations and over 20 to 25 years, they just felt like they needed to be participating and not give up to Chrysler. But by 2008, about the time that the recession was going to hit, they just gave up an entire market. It still bothers me to this day, but I understand why they did it. It was probably a smart decision to capture a rising market by moving into SUVs, but still, you've got an American manufacturer that, not because the market just wasn't there, it still feels like they just gave up because they knew they weren't willing to develop the resources, to devote the resources, the money, the platform development, to not just compete and have an entry, but to really go try to be the best at something. They literally just gave up. Thanks for being here, guys.